Welcome to the new episode of History of Revolution. How are you? Hope your week was fine.
Doing well, thanks. Ready to get into it? It was quite a week preparing for this one.
I bet. It's a big topic. That was maybe a bit formal, but we are diving right into the deep end today.
We really are.
We've got a pretty complex and fascinating set of sources here. We're looking at arguably the biggest strategic shift maybe in 20th century political history.
It's definitely up there. We're talking about how Mao Zedong took classical Marxist theory and, well, fundamentally re-engineered it.
Yeah, completely overhauled it to fit the staggering reality of China at the time.
Exactly. So our mission in this deep dive today is really to understand the Chinese Revolution, but specifically focusing on Mao's big insight.
The pivot.
The pivot, yes, from the industrial working class, the traditional focus, towards the peasantry.
And we're tailoring this deep dive for you, the listener, especially if maybe you're newer to world history or some of these foundational Marxist concepts. We're going to try and connect all the dots.
Right. Because if you're coming at this fresh, the core idea in classical Marxism, from Marx himself and later thinkers like Lenin, is that revolution happens in highly industrialized places.
The cities.
The cities. It's the massive concentrated urban proletariat, the factory workers who rise up against the capitalist owners, the bourgeoisie. That's the model.
But China in the 1920s, the 1930s, it just didn't look like that at all.
Not even close. It was overwhelmingly rural. Something like, 80% plus of the population were peasants working the land. They weren't factory workers in big industrial centers.
So the core question we really have to tackle today, it sounds simple, but it's profound. How on earth did a revolution succeed in a country like that? Predominantly agricultural and also semi-colonial, when the classical theory was all about the urban industrial working class.
And the sources we're looking at, including Mao's own writings and historical frameworks from people like Jürgen Osterhammel, they make one point really clear.
Which is?
That the revolution wasn't some kind of historical accident or a weird deviation from the norm. It was seen, from a Marxist perspective at least, as a necessary response. Almost inevitable, given the extreme oppression.
And that oppression came from a unique mix, didn't it? Internal feudal structures colliding with this massive external pressure from imperialism and global capitalism.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And that necessity, that sheer weight of oppression, that's where we have to start. You can't really grasp Mao's solution, his strategic shift, without understanding just how bad the problem was.
Okay, so let's set the stage. We'll begin with Section 1, the context of oppression and semi-colonialism.
Good place to start.
Yeah.
We really need to understand China's unique position at the time. Osterhammel calls it semi-colonial.
And that's a key distinction, isn't it? It wasn't a formal colony like, say, British India or French Indochina.
Exactly.
Right.
China never technically lost its full sovereignty in the same way. It still had its own currency. It conducted its own foreign policy. It was recognized internationally as a sovereign state.
But, and this is the crucial but, the level of control exercised over it by foreign powers was immense.
Yeah. Profound, yeah. It wasn't formal colonization, like putting a viceroy in charge, but it was absolutely debilitating control nonetheless.
Osterhammel calls it an informal empire, enforced mainly by Western powers, Britain, the U.S., France, but also increasingly by Japan.
Right. And these informal controls, taken together, absolutely constituted imperialism in the Marxist sense. And they weren't just minor annoyances. They struck at the heart of Chinese sovereignty and daily life.
The sources give some pretty devastating examples of this. Maybe the most blatant one is extraterritoriality.
Ah, yes. Explain that one.
Well, it meant that foreign nationals, so British merchants, American missionaries, Japanese factory owners operating in China, they were completely exempt from Chinese law.
Think about that. If a foreigner committed a crime on Chinese soil,
they couldn't be tried by a Chinese court. They had to be tried by a court from their own nation, often located in a foreign concession within China. It just fundamentally undermined China's judicial sovereignty.
And it wasn't just legal, it was deeply economic too. Until 1930, China lacked tariff autonomy.
Which sounds technical, but what did it mean in practice?
It meant foreign powers effectively dictated China's customs duties, its import taxes. Beijing couldn't set its own tariffs to protect its own fragile, emerging industries from the flood of cheap manufactured goods coming in from Britain, Japan, America.
So no way to nurture domestic industry. It effectively blocked any real independent economic policy.
Absolutely strangled it at birth. And beyond tariffs, Foreign entities gained control over key economic sectors, mining, early manufacturing, transportation like railways.
And critically, public finance, the money itself.
Yeah. Foreigners often controlled the agencies that collected the government's main revenue streams, like the Maritime Customs Service, if foreigners are collecting your taxes for you.
They basically control your financial independence. You can't fund your own state effectively.
It locks you into dependency. And this created a really destructive trade pattern. China was pushed into exporting raw materials, agricultural stuff, minerals.
While simultaneously being forced to import manufactured consumer goods from the imperial powers.
Right. A classic colonial, or in this case, semi-colonial pattern. It ensured China stayed technologically and economically behind, unable to build its own proper industrial base.
And this system had a very specific human impact inside China. It created these internal collaborators.
The ones Mao later targets very clearly. The comprador bourgeoisie.
Explain who they were.
These were Chinese merchants, officials, middlemen, whose power, whose wealth, whose whole reason for being was tied up with the foreign imperialist system. They profited from acting as agents for foreign capital.
So you have this external system of exploitation, which is then actively propped up and facilitated by a layer of internal collaborators who benefit from it.
Exactly. And that leads us straight into this concept that became central to the revolutionary analysis of the three mountains of oppression.
Right. This phrase comes up a lot. It's a way of summarizing the total burden crushing the Chinese masses, especially the peasants.
It bundles these interconnected forces together. So first you had imperialism, the external foreign powers controlling the economy and politics.
Mountain number one.
Mountain number two, feudalism. This refers to the centuries-old oppressive traditional landlord system. Crippling rents, peasants trapped in debt through usury, lack of land.
The internal pre-existing exploitation.
Right. And mountain number three, bureaucratic capitalism. This was the corrupt system run by state officials and merchants who were often deeply intertwined with both foreign interests and the old landlord class.
So it's not just three separate problems. The core Marxist analysis here, the backdrop that Mao argued legitimized revolution, was that these three forces weren't acting independently.
No. They formed a kind of tactical alliance. They consciously worked together, or at least their interests aligned, to support the most backward parts of Chinese society. The landlords, the moneylenders, the compradors.
All to prop up this system of extreme exploitation.
An exploitation that was fundamentally incompatible with developing China's own productive forces. It choked off independent growth, kept the vast majority, especially in the countryside, in desperate poverty, and offered no way out through reform.
That level of severity, that feeling of total blockage, is the essential context for Mao's next big intellectual step, figuring out who could actually fight back.
Exactly. If the oppression is that bad, who has the power, the motivation, and crucially the numbers to overthrow it? Which brings us to section 2, mapping the revolution's allies and enemies. This leans heavily on Mao's foundational 1926 analysis.
Right, because Mao looked back at previous revolutionary attempts in China, like the 1911 revolution that overthrew the emperor.
And saw failures. He argued they failed precisely because the leaders didn't correctly identify who their real friends were and who their real enemies were. They either fought the wrong groups or failed to unite the potentially friendly forces.
So in this really seminal 1926 article, Analysis of the Classes in Chinese Society, he tackles this question head-on. It's almost the first sentence, isn't it?
Pretty much. Who are our enemies? Who are our friends? This is a question of the first importance for the revolution. He said the Revolutionary Party must pay painstaking attention to uniting its real friends to attack its real enemies. Otherwise, failure was guaranteed.
And the basis for figuring this out, sticking to classical Marxist methods, had to be objective.
Objective economic status. Where does each class sit in this system of production? What's the relationship to capital, to land, to imperialism? And from that economic position, what is their likely attitude towards a fundamental revolution?
Okay, so let's break it down according to Mao's analysis, starting with the enemies. Who did he identify?
The principal enemies were identified very clearly, the landlord class and the comprador class. He saw them essentially acting as a single reactionary bloc.
And why were they the principal enemy?
Because of their absolute dependency on the system he wanted to overthrow. In semi-colonial China, Mao described them as being completely the vassals of the international bourgeoisie. Their existence, their wealth, their political power, it all flowed from imperialism.
So they had no incentive to change the fundamental structure.
None at all. They represented the most backward and the most reactionary relations of production. The old feudal land system combined with this new dependency on foreign capital. By siding with imperialism, they formed the extreme counter-revolutionary group.
They are, in effect, the internal face of the external imperialist oppression we talked about earlier.
Exactly. That dependence is the absolute key. If your money, your political backing, your military support comes from outside forces benefiting from the status quo, you will serve those foreign interests, not the interests of national development or the masses.
Okay, enemies identified. Now things get more complicated. The middle ground.
Ah, yes, the incredibly complex, contradictory group. The vacillating middle ground. This is primarily the national bourgeoisie.
Who are these people?
This class represents the small pockets of genuine, native Chinese capitalist development. Chinese factory owners, merchants, bankers, who weren't directly tied to foreign capital in the same way the compradors were. They were trying to build an independent Chinese capitalism.
But their position was inherently unstable, wasn't it? They were caught in the middle.
Completely. They faced this classic political quandary. On the one hand, when foreign capital, backed by foreign guns, and the local warlords squeezed them, they favored revolution.
Why? What was their goal?
They hoped a revolution would create a unified, strong Chinese state, free from foreign domination and internal chaos, where they could become the dominant class. They wanted to become the big industrialists, the real national capitalists, running their own show.
Okay, so far sounds potentially revolutionary,
Yeah.
but here's a contradiction.
Exactly. They were terrified of the masses rising up from below. The moment the industrial proletariat started getting organized, militant, demanding workers' rights.
And especially when international forces like the Soviet Union started supporting the Chinese Communist Party.
This national bourgeoisie got very nervous. They sensed a threat to their own ultimate goal, which was to replace the old exploiters, landlords, compradors, not to abolish exploitation altogether. They wanted to be the new bosses, not liberate the workers. So they became deeply skeptical of radical revolution.
We have that fantastic quote in the source material attributed to a follower of an anti-communist leader at the time.
Yeah, the true disciple of Tai Chi Tao, who apparently wrote, "Raise your left fist to knock down imperialism and your right fist to knock down the Communist Party."
That just perfectly captures their dilemma. Get the foreigners out, yes, but definitely don't let the workers take over our factories.
And Mao's analysis here was quite prescient. He foresaw this inevitable split. He argued that in a real revolutionary upsurge, this middle class couldn't stay neutral. It would inevitably fracture.
Some would lean left.
Some sections would be drawn into the revolution, maybe out of patriotism or seeing it as the only way forward. But others, fearing the loss of their property and status, would inevitably swing right and join the counter-revolution.
He concluded, quite starkly, that there was no room for any to remain independent. Their political neutrality was a temporary illusion that the pressure of revolution would shatter.
You had to choose sides eventually.
Okay, so we have the enemies, we have the shaky middle ground. Now, where are the potential allies? The mass base.
This brings us to the petty bourgeoisie. Mao considered this group extremely large and strategically vital, deserving great attention.
Who falls into this category? It seems quite broad.
It is broad. It includes owner peasants, those who owned and farmed their own small plot of land, master handicraftsmen. Petty intellectuals think students, lower-level government clerks, primary school teachers, small lawyers, small traders operating independently, a huge swath of society.
And Mao didn't just lump them all together, did he? He broke them down further.
Yes, and this is where the analysis gets really nuanced. He divided the petty bourgeoisie into 3 subgroups based on their economic situation and therefore their likely political attitude.
Let's hear them.
First, the right wing. This was a minority within the petty bourgeoisie. These were the folks who were doing relatively okay, maybe even had a small annual surplus. They dreamed of climbing up into the middle class, becoming richer.
So their attitude to revolution.
Timid.
Yeah.
Afraid of upsetting the authorities, skeptical of radical change. They might have grumbled about taxes, but they feared revolution might cost them what little they had. They preferred gradual reform, if anything.
Okay, the aspirational ones, then.
Second, the middle group. This was the largest chunk, maybe half of the entire petty bourgeoisie. These people were basically self-supporting, just about making ends meet. They definitely felt the squeeze from imperialists, warlords, landlords, moneylenders. They knew the world wasn't fair.
But were they ready to jump into revolution?
Hesitant. They saw the injustice, but they also feared chaos. Mao described them as remaining neutral for the most part, but crucially, they would never actively oppose the revolution. They wouldn't join the counter-revolutionaries.
Okay, the cautious majority. And the third group.
The third group, the left wing, was politically the most important for mobilizing the revolution initially. These were the petty bourgeois, whose standard of living was actively declining.
People falling into poverty.
Exactly. They were facing deficits year after year, accumulating debt, maybe losing their land or small business. Mao used this evocative phrase. They shudder as if with cold at the thought of the future.
They felt desperate.
Utterly. And therefore, they were seen as a very important force within the revolutionary movement, highly receptive to radical ideas because they felt they had a little left to lose and the current system was destroying them.
So Mao's strategic thinking here, based on observing things like the May 30th movement in 1925,
Was that if the proletariat could initiate a powerful revolutionary wave, create real momentum.
it wouldn't just sweep up the desperate left wing of the petty bourgeoisie.
No, the momentum would be strong enough to pull in the huge middle group as well, and potentially even sections of the right wing who might see the revolution as the winning side or the only path to national salvation.
So a massive potential pool of allies, but needing activation by a leading force.
Precisely. Which brings us finally to the groups Mao identified as the staunchest allies, the proletariat and semi-proletariat.
And given China's reality, we have to talk about the rural masses first, right? The overwhelming majority.
Absolutely, the semi-proletariat. This category included several groups, but the vast majority were the semi-tenant peasants and the poor peasants.
For Mao, when you talked about the peasant problem in China, you were essentially talking about their problem.
Let's define those terms, because the distinctions are crucial for understanding rural China. The poor peasants.
These were peasants who owned no land at all, zero. They rented everything they farmed from landlords, and after paying the rent, which could be half the harvest or even more, plus various other dues,
They were left with barely enough to survive, often not even that.
they were tenant peasants, exploited to the absolute maximum by the landlord class. Mao saw them as the most hard-pressed group in the countryside and therefore very receptive to revolutionary agitation. They had nothing, materially speaking. Okay, the poorest of the poor, then the semi-tenant peasants.
Their situation was slightly better, but still incredibly hard. They might own a tiny patch of land, but it was never enough to feed their family.
So they had to supplement it.
Exactly. They had to rent additional land from landlords, borrow money at exorbitant interest rates just to buy seed or survive the winter, and they often ran out of food before the next harvest came in.
Still deeply exploited.
Deeply. Mao judged their revolutionary potential as higher than the owner peasants who were in the petty bourgeoisie, but perhaps slightly less consistently desperate than the completely landless poor peasants. Still, a core revolutionary class.
And this semi-proletariat category also included urban groups.
Yes, Mao included handicraftsmen who were being driven out of business by foreign machine-made goods, shop assistants working long hours for tiny wages with endless grievances, and peddlers, street vendors with hardly any capital trying to eke out a living.
All sharing that same experience of poverty and exploitation.
Right. All driven towards the idea that only a fundamental revolution could change their desperate circumstances. Hey, listener, do you have any other idea or question about this? Please write in comments.
Okay, so that's the vast semi-proletariat, mostly rural. Now, what about the class traditionally seen as the leader in Marxist theory, the proletariat?
Right, the modern industrial working class. And here's the statistical reality Mao had to confront. They were numerically tiny in China. Perhaps only 2 million people total, maybe less at the time he was writing.
A drop in the ocean in a country of 400 million plus, which reflects China's economic backwardness, its lack of industrialization.
Exactly. But Mao stressed their quality over their sheer quantity. He argued they represented China's new productive forces, the future, and were inherently the most progressive class.
Why? What gave them this leading role despite their small numbers?
Two main interconnected reasons, according to Mao's analysis. First, their high concentration. Unlike peasants scattered across the vast countryside, industrial workers were packed together.
In specific locations.
Yes, in railways, mines, textile mills, shipbuilding yards, often working in large enterprises, frequently owned by foreign capital or the state. This concentration made them much easier to organize politically and gave their actions, like strikes, enormous leverage.
And the second reason.
Their extremely low economic status. They were the definition of proletarians deprived of all means of production except their own labor power. And they were subjected to the most ruthless, relentless exploitation by imperialists, warlords, and the native bourgeoisie. Low wages, terrible conditions, no rights.
So they had nothing to lose but their chains, as the classic phrase goes, and they were organized in a way that allowed them to fight effectively.
That's the idea. They had the structural capacity to fight back in a way the peasantry initially did not. The sources point to their power through historical examples.
Like the big strikes.
Yeah, the massive seamen strike in 1922, the really important, though tragically suppressed, railway strike of 1922-23, the coal mine strikes, and especially the huge general strikes in Shanghai and Hong Kong after the May 30th movement in 1925.
These events showed that even though they were few, the industrial proletariat could paralyze key sectors of the economy and pose a serious political threat.
Immense power, yeah. And we should also quickly mention the other proletarian groups, Mao included.
Like the rural proletariat.
Yes, the farm laborers. People who owned no land and didn't even rent land, but worked for wages for richer peasants or landlords, hired by the year, the month, or the day. Also entirely landless and exploited.
And the lumpen proletariat.
This refers to the unstable elements, unemployed workers, peasants who had lost their land and drifted into cities, soldiers, beggars, petty criminals. Mao acknowledged they could be destructive if left unguided,
But potentially useful.
potentially a revolutionary force if properly guided by the Communist Party. They were desperate and numerous.
Okay, so let's pull all that together. Mao's final foundational class map looks like this.
The landlord and comprador classes, totally tied to imperialism, are the main enemies.
The vacillating national bourgeoisie is unreliable, needs to be watched carefully, potentially split.
The huge petty bourgeoisie, owner peasants, artisans, intellectuals, needs careful handling, but contains a massive potential reserve of allies, especially its left wing.
And the core, most reliable forces are
The semi-proletariat, poor peasants, semi-tenant peasants, urban poor, the most numerous allies, and the industrial proletariat, numerically small, but the most concentrated, politically conscious, and therefore the leading force of the revolution.
that careful mapping was the essential first step.
Absolutely essential for figuring out how to actually make the revolution happen.
By the way, if you liked and interested so far, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment. It's really important for us to continue this series. Okay, so we have the map of allies and enemies. This leads us directly into Section 3, Mao's strategic breakthrough, the peasant revolution. Because if the industrial proletariat was the designated leading force, but it was tiny, how did the revolution build an army big enough to actually win?
Right. How do you win a civil war against the nationalists, who had a much larger conventional army, often backed by foreign powers, if your leading class is only 2 million people? This required a fundamental break with established thinking.
A break with orthodoxy, as the historical analysis points out, because orthodox Marxism, based on European experience,
Wirtz really saw a revolution as an urban event. Workers seizing the factories, the cities, the centers of power and industry first. The countryside is often seen as backward, maybe needing liberation after the cities fell, but not the source of revolutionary power itself.
But Mao looked at China's reality. 80% plus rural, feudal-like conditions persisting, a tiny industrial base, trying to copy the European model, like focusing solely on urban uprising.
The NIDES was doomed to fail. It had been tried and it had failed. The 2 million industrial workers could provide political leadership, cadres, ideology, but they could never physically populate the mass army needed to conquer a continent.
So Mao's great insight, born from hard experience and observation, was fundamentally practical.
It was about recognizing the potential that was actually there. The Chinese peasantry, suffering under those 3 mountains we discussed.
They had very clear, immediate enemies. The local landlord collecting rent, the corrupt official demanding taxes, the foreign presence disrupting their lives.
And crucially, they had deep, pre-existing community bonds and structures in their villages. This combination, clear grievances and existing social cohesion, meant the peasantry possessed enormous, if latent, revolutionary potential.
And this is the key, if someone could actually address their most fundamental needs.
Exactly. Mao essentially solved the problem of where the revolution's main forces would come from. He identified the peasantry, particularly the poor and semi-tenant peasants who formed the majority, as the staunchest and most numerous ally.
Not just supporters, but the main fighting force.
The main fighting force, the sea in which the revolutionary fish would swim. This strategic pivot permanently altered the classical Marxist model, certainly for agrarian, semi-colonial societies across the globe.
And if your main force is in the countryside, your whole military strategy has to change too, which led directly to the strategy of rural bases and guerrilla warfare.
Completely different from traditional armies focused on capturing and holding cities. Mao developed a military and political strategy that was based almost entirely in the vast, often remote, difficult to control, rural interior of China.
How did it work? What were the stages?
Well, stage one was about establishing secure base areas. These were often called rural Soviets. They'd set these up in geographically difficult terrain, mountains, border regions, places where the enemy's conventional forces couldn't easily penetrate or sustain operations.
What was the purpose of these bases? Just military defense?
Military security was crucial, yes, a place to rest, regroup, train forces, but they were also vital political laboratories. Within these liberated zones, the communists could start implementing their revolutionary program.
Like land reform.
Primarily land reform,
Yeah.
but also setting up peasant associations, literacy programs, new forms of local governance. They were demonstrating what the revolution meant in practice, winning peasant loyalty through action, not just words.
Okay, so establish secure bases. Then what?
Stage two was expanding influence. From these secure bases, the communist forces, the Red Army, would use guerrilla tactics. Hit-and-run raids, ambushes, sabotage, avoiding decisive battles they couldn't win yet.
The goal wasn't just military harassment, though, right?
No, the goal was political as much as military. To constantly expand the territory under revolutionary influence, undermine the enemy's control, and crucially, build deeper, sustained support among the peasant population by addressing their local grievances, protecting them from landlords or bandits. Operating, as Mao famously said, like fish swimming in the sea of the people.
And only much later came conventional warfare.
Exactly. Stage three, conventional warfare, only really became dominant towards the end of the Civil War. The communists transitioned to large-scale battles, besieging and capturing major cities, only after years of rural mobilization had allowed them to build up a large, experienced, and well-supported army capable of defeating the nationalist forces decisively. It completely reversed the classic strategic assumption of cities first.
And the engine driving that peasant support, the thing that made them willing to shelter, feed, and join the Red Army, was fundamental.
See, land reform as the mobilizing tool. It was simple and direct. Within those rural Soviets, the immediate focus was taking land from landlords and richer peasants and redistributing it to the poor and landless peasants.
This fulfilled the peasants' most basic, urgent material need. Ownership of the soil they worked, freedom from crippling rents, and the constant threat of debt and starvation.
It gave them a direct, tangible stake in the revolution's success. Defending the Red Army meant defending their newly acquired land.
And the effectiveness of this whole rural strategy was brutally tested, wasn't it, during the Long March?
Absolutely. The Long March of 1934-1935. This was a massive military retreat covering 6,000 miles under constant attack from the nationalists and local warlords. The communist armies were decimated.
How did they survive?
The historical consensus is clear. They survived only because of the vital support they received from local peasants along the route.
Even in areas they were just passing through.
Yes. As the Red Army columns moved through different provinces, often facing hostile local elites, it was the poor and semi-tenant peasants who provided food, shelter, intelligence about enemy movements, guides through difficult terrain. They hid wounded soldiers. They joined the army.
It proved the fundamental premise, didn't it? That peasants weren't just passive bystanders waiting to be liberated.
They became active, absolutely indispensable participants in the revolutionary process, because the revolution, through its promise and initial implementation of land reform, had given them a reason to participate, a stake in its survival.
And the ultimate payoff, the validation of this entire peasant-centric strategy, came in 1949.
Right. As historians note, the communist victory was achieved primarily through this long, grinding process of building peasant support via rural bases and guerrilla warfare. The final capture of the major cities like Shanghai, Nanjing, Beijing, that was just the culmination, the conventional endgame, made possible only by the preceding 2 decades of deep rural struggle.
It was a massive, world-altering practical innovation. It cemented Mao's place in revolutionary history and provided a model, or at least an inspiration, for countless other movements in agrarian societies facing imperialism across Asia, Africa, and Latin America.
It demonstrated, perhaps more clearly than anywhere else, that revolutionary strategy must be radically adapted to local material conditions.
Yeah.
You couldn't just import a model from industrial Europe and expect it to work in rural China.
But, and this is a significant but, this very success, the massive mobilization, the intense focus on polarizing the countryside around land and class, it also led to some serious problems and, frankly, tragic consequences in how it was applied on the ground.
Yes. Which brings us to our final section, section 4, the divergence of theory and reality. This is where the political needs of the revolution, as interpreted by the party, started to clash, sometimes quite severely, with the objective economic facts in specific villages.
Let's start with the positive side, the objective economic reality of the land revolution itself, roughly 1946 to 1952. It was undeniably transformative.
Oh, absolutely monumental. The sources, like analysis from Lippitt, confirm huge changes. Something like 43% of China's cultivated land was redistributed. This effectively eliminated the landlord class as an economic force, ended the burden of rent payments for hundreds of millions of peasants, and arguably helped channel capital previously absorbed by rent into developing urban industry. A massive social and economic restructuring.
So the big picture transformation was real and profound.
However, as scholars like Philip C. Huang have meticulously documented, particularly in his work on rural class struggle, the party's political representation of class structure, especially within individual villages, often started to diverge quite sharply from that objective economic reality, even the reality created by the land reform itself.
So the macro theory, landlords bad, peasants good, was clear, but applying it at the micro level became problematic.
Exactly. The party leadership insisted on applying its broad national analysis, this idea that every community must have oppressors and oppressed. That class struggle was the universal dynamic to every single village, regardless of the specific local conditions.
And this turned land reform from just an economic policy into something else.
It turned it into a high-stakes moral drama, a mandatory performance of good versus evil, revolutionary peasants versus counter-revolutionary landlords. That had to be enacted in every community.
But reality on the ground was often much messier, wasn't it? Huang gives examples from the North China Plain.
Right. In many villages there, for instance, there simply weren't many, or even any, resident feudal landlords of the type described in the revolutionary rhetoric.
Yeah.
The really big landowners were often absentee, living in towns or cities, disconnected from village life.
And even when there were people classified as landlords living in the village.
They were often quite small owners. Sometimes, Huang notes, they were landlords in name only, perhaps widows or elderly people who physically couldn't farm the land themselves due to lack of male labor power, so they had to rent it out just to survive. They weren't necessarily the big rapacious exploiters of the stereotype. Sometimes managerial farmers, who were essentially rich peasants employing labor, got lumped in with feudal landlords. The definitions could be stretched.
So the party faced a choice. Acknowledge that in some villages, the class enemy, as defined by the land reform law, was weak or non-existent, or
insist on finding or even creating class struggle everywhere to fulfill the political imperative of mobilization. And overwhelmingly, they chose the latter. This leads to what Huang calls a mandate to manufacture class struggle.
why? What was the political goal driving this?
It was partly about ensuring revolutionary fervor didn't die down. A village deeply polarized by struggle, where peasants had actively participated in overthrowing enemies, was seen as more politically reliable, a better source for army recruits and tax grain than a village that just passively received land from cadres. Mobilization required enemies.
And this meant that class labels, landlords, rich peasant, started to become detached from strict economic analysis.
Increasingly detached, they became political weapons, often guided by crude numerical quotas sent down from higher administrative levels. Find X number of landlords in this district. This became more important than a careful, objective assessment of who was actually exploiting whom through rent or usury, according to the party's own laws.
This distortion became most severe during the intense period of the Civil War, 1946-1949.
Yes, Huang identifies this as the peak period for these kinds of arbitrary classifications. He gives the example of Wugan village in Hebei province. Initially, the class labels assigned seemed to match the economic reality reasonably well.
But then things changed.
As the pressure for radical mobilization intensified, driven by military needs, things went off the rails. Cadres started engaging in fantastic labeling. Around 70 households of middle peasants, people who were basically self-sufficient, maybe hired a little labor occasionally but weren't primarily exploiters, were arbitrarily reclassified as rich peasants or even landlords, simply to meet quotas for struggle targets imposed from above.
And this wasn't just a label change, it had real consequences.
Deadly consequences. Victims of this mislabeling were often subjected to struggle sessions, beaten, humiliated, their property confiscated. Some were killed, all because their political classification was deemed necessary, regardless of their actual economic role.
And it wasn't just about meeting quotas, was it? Sometimes people were labeled class enemies for other reasons entirely.
Right. If someone was simply unpopular in the village, or if they had ties to the losing nationalist side, the Kuomintang, or if they'd converted to Christianity, or even just behaved badly or were seen as an outsider, they could easily be lumped in as a class enemy during the land reform struggles.
Regardless of how much land they actually owned or rented out.
Exactly. Their perceived political opposition or social deviance became grounds for classifying them as an enemy of the revolution, fitting them into the pre-existing categories of landlords or rich peasant, even if their material class position, as defined by the party's own land reform law, didn't warrant it.
This leads to a really crucial shift, doesn't it? The shift from material class to symbolic discourse.
Yes, the party's decision, driven by the need for mobilization, to frame land reform primarily as this intense moral drama, created this powerful, almost irresistible imperative to manufacture class enemies, where they didn't objectively exist in sufficient numbers or clear-cut forms.
And the consequence was that the very meaning of class began to change.
It transformed. It moved away from its original material meaning in Marxist-Leninist theory, which is fundamentally about your relationship to the means of production. Do you own land factories and exploit others, or do you sell your labor? And took on a much more powerful symbolic moral meaning.
So the labels themselves, landlords, rich peasant, started to signify something more than just economic status.
They became primarily markers of political allegiance and moral standing within the revolution. As analysts like Hinton and Dingling observed, the categories took on meanings that were more symbolic and moral than material. Being labeled a landlord increasingly meant you were an enemy of the people of the party, rather than necessarily you extract surplus value through feudal rent.
And this way of using class labels became dominant.
It became what we call a hegemonic discourse. It provided the universal language, the framework for understanding all political conflict and opposition. This is where those later broader categories emerged. The four types of enemies, landlords, rich peasants, counter-revolutionaries, bad elements, criminals, and later the black five kinds, adding rightists.
So anyone deemed an enemy of the party or the state for almost any reason could be fitted into this overarching category of class enemy, blurring the lines between economic exploitation and political dissent.
Exactly. The symbolic power of the class enemy label expanded to cover all forms of opposition.
And tragically, this whole system, the manufactured struggle, the symbolic use of class labels, the methods used, served as a direct prelude to the Cultural Revolution.
A direct and chilling prelude. Look at the Four Cleans movement, which happened between 1962 and 1966. It was explicitly promoted by some as the Second Land Reform.
What was its purpose?
It was designed in part to reenact that original revolutionary class struggle. A new generation of activists, often young intellectuals sent down from the cities, were mobilized to go into the villages and root out hidden class enemies and corruption.
Who were they targeting?
The idea was often to link supposed new class enemies above, like potentially corrupt rural cadres, with the old, already designated class enemies below. This often gave license to scapegoat figures who were already powerless, people who had been struggled against repeatedly for 2 decades.
Like the example mentioned in Huang's work.
Yes, people like Lu Guantong and Huai Yanqiao, who became targets again, despite having lost any real power years before. The focus shifted almost entirely from any remaining economic exploitation, which was minimal by then, as land was collectivized, to political attitude, past histories, and perceived loyalty.
And crucially, the methods used in the Four Cleans and then massively amplified in the Cultural Revolution
Were drawn directly from the playbook of the earlier land reform struggles. The public humiliation, the dunce camps, the placards listing supposed crimes, the struggle sessions, the arbitrary denunciations and violence. These rituals of persecution were rehearsed and codified during land reform and then unleashed on a national scale later.
So by the time of the Cultural Revolution proper, 1966, 1976, the connection between class labels and any kind of objective material reality was almost completely gone.
Essentially severed. Since the property of the original landlord and rich peasant classes had been confiscated or collectivized years before, class status became almost purely a matter of political attitude, as defined by whoever held power at that moment.
It became what some call the politics of representation. What mattered wasn't what you did economically, but how your political stance, your background, your family history was represented or labeled by those in control.
Right, this arbitrary symbolic labeling, completely divorced from material reality, combined with the brutal methods inherited from the land reform struggles, reached its horrific climax during the Cultural Revolution. But ultimately, this total detachment from reality led to deep societal cynicism and the eventual collapse of that specific discourse of class struggle. People stopped believing in the labels.
Okay. Let's try to pull back and summarize this huge, complex, and often tragic story.
Mao Zedong's critical world-changing realization was that in a place like China, semi-colonial, overwhelmingly agrarian, the main revolutionary force, the chief ally, simply had to be the peasantry.
It wasn't an ideological preference initially, it was a practical necessity.
A necessity born out of the sheer scale of oppression from imperialism, feudalism, and bureaucratic capital, and the objective fact that classical capitalism hadn't developed a large enough industrial proletariat to lead the revolution in the traditional way.
And this practical innovation, focusing on the peasantry and developing rural guerrilla warfare, was incredibly successful in achieving state power. It fundamentally altered Marxist theory and practice for much of the non-industrialized world.
But the primary struggle, in the Marxist analysis underpinning it all, remained consistent in theory. The industrial proletariat, though small, was still seen as the leading force, representing the new, modern, productive forces needed to build socialism.
And the fight was against those forces seen as allied with imperialism and backwardness, the warlords, the compradors, the big landlords, the corrupt bureaucrats. The goal was a people's revolution led by the working class in alliance with the peasantry.
Right, and the whole epic, bloody struggle demonstrates the absolute necessity of adapting revolutionary theory and strategy to concrete material conditions, especially when confronting the combined forces of global capitalism and entrenched internal systems of exploitation, like feudalism.
The sheer weight of exploitation in rural China created the largest potential revolutionary force on Earth. And tapping into that force required moving the revolution's center of gravity from the city to the countryside, a move that didn't just change China, but profoundly shaped the course of the entire 20th century.
A truly monumental shift, with consequences we are still grappling with today.
Don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment. See you on next episode, comrades. Bye-bye.